Good morning, everyone. For people who are on, I'm going to wait a couple of minutes just to let other people sign on. So I'm going to sit here quietly for a few minutes whilst I just let some people join. And we'll start this off in a couple of minutes. Okay, everyone, I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this web-based meeting. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently based, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to take a moment to pay my respect to their elders past, present, and future, and acknowledge the rich culture and history that they have brought to this beautiful country. And as we begin this meeting, I would also like to extend the same recognition and respect to all Indigenous persons who are participating and tuning in today from around the country. Yours and your family's contributions to this land and its cultures are an invaluable part of our shared history and heritage, for which I'm very, very grateful. So welcome to everybody to this webinar. Thank you all for taking the time for joining me this morning. My name is Deborah Coram. I'm the CEO of Safetrac. I'd like to issue a warm welcome to our Safetrac clients, many of whom I know, and to those who are new and joining us, welcome to this very important topic on the new Respect at Work laws, which are aimed at eliminating sexual harassment from our workplaces. I understand your time is precious, and so I will move ahead with getting through a very large volume of content in a very short amount of time. I could probably do a presentation on almost every slide in this presentation because the content is quite voluminous. So I'm going to try and move quickly. If after the webinar you think there's a topic that you'd really like us to focus on and do, let us know. We're happy to do that. And I'll just, as a means of housekeeping, just to let you know, there is a chat that's available. If you've got questions that you'd like to submit, please go ahead and do that. And I have got a few of you have submitted questions before the webinar, which I'll try and address at the end. To the extent that you ask questions that I don't have time to cover in today's webinar, at the conclusion of today's session, I will send around a list of Q&As for you all so that we will address everything that is asked to us in the best possible way that we can. Before I move on, I just wanted to move to an analysis of who's actually joining us today. It's of great interest to me and us for us to look at the breakout of who's interested in this topic. And when we look at this, we can see that people and culture and HR are representing 50% of the attendees today. And then we've got risk and compliance and legal are making up more than another quarter. And then we've got the C-suite operations and WHS affected as well. And what we're seeing about this legislation is that all those groups represented today are, yes, all the groups that are impacted by this legislation. And that this is a piece of legislation that impacts our entire organisation, and that this is something that we're going to all need to work together to do to ensure that we're compliant with the new legislation, and that all of our departments need to work together to develop policies and procedures and training in order to properly train, educate, report, investigate, monitor, and work together to collectively promote a culture of respect and inclusion, and one that prevents sexual harassment from occurring. So in terms of the topics that we're going to cover today, I'm going to go through a brief overview of the new changes to the Respect at Work Act, an overview of what those new laws are. We're going to go through what is and isn't sexual harassment, the impacts of it, the consequences of non-compliance, how we're going to go about preventing it, the role of leadership in prevention, and we're going to look at some surveying, training and reporting as a means of helping us stay compliant with the legislation. And then at the end, we'll move towards a Q&A where I will address some of the questions that have come in before and if any during the seminar. So just a quick poll before we get started. What I'd like to know is how familiar the attendees are today with the Respect at Work Act. Are we very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar? So that's looking like moving towards a somewhat familiar to a not familiar. Some very familiar, so that's wonderful. I probably won't be able to tell you anything, but we're certainly in a territory where people are just learning, and we have a long way to go in order to move forward with ensuring our organisations are compliant with the legislation. So I'm going to move forward from that, and I'm going to go on to the next slide. I'll get you, Katie, if you could close that out. That'd be great, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the Respect at Work Act. In November of last year, the Federal Parliament passed the Anti-Discrimination and Human Rights legislation known as the Respect at Work Act, which essentially introduced several amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act. Essentially, the laws are a major change as they move organisations to having a prevention focus. The amendments impose a positive duty on employers to take reasonable and proportionate measures to prevent and eliminate sexual harassment. Effectively, that means that we as an organisation need to move from a response or reactive-based approach to sexual harassment incidents when they occur to one that is more proactive and focused on prevention. In addition, the Australian Human Rights Commission has been given the power to enforce the positive duty obligation. So effectively, the Human Rights Commission becomes like a new regulator. The AHRC can now prepare and publish guidelines for compliance, which, by the way, they have done a marvellous job of. And I do encourage you all to visit the Respect at Work website that they've built. They have a myriad of marvellous materials and guidance available to you all to help you comply with the new legislation. They will be able to inquire into matters of systemic or suspected systemic unlawful discrimination and non-compliance with the duty, and they will be able to deal with complaints received up to 24 months after the alleged act. The new AHRC powers will come into effect 12 months after the enactment of the legislation. So 12 months from November, the AHRC will effectively become a regulator, and all of you and all of your companies will be bound by the new legislation. So effectively, they're basically giving all companies 12 months to be compliant with the legislation. Now, the reason they've done that is that the positive duty is enormous. It requires a completely holistic view of our organisation to change from sexual harassment being illegal to you ensuring that is not occurring in your workplace. So I'm going to step back a little bit, and we're going to look at what that actually means in order to be compliant. So in order to look at preventing sexual harassment in the workplace, firstly, what are you going to need to do is firstly look at your policies and procedures that are currently in existence and whether or not they are compliant with the new obligations under the Sexual Discrimination Act. To the extent that they are not compliant with the new legislation, They need to be reviewed. All policies, systems, and procedures need to be reviewed to identify deficiencies to ensure they're in line with the new Sex Discrimination Act. We need to ensure that all our policies, procedures, and all of our training is updated to ensure that the likelihood of unlawful conduct from occurring is reduced. Because this also affects our obligations under the work health and safety legislation, we need to ensure that all of our work health and safety practices, assessments, risk management matrices, frameworks are all updated to identify and control risks of sexual harassment and discrimination. We then need to provide employees, managers, leaders across the business with the skills to understand where this sort of action occurs from and what they can be doing to prevent it. We then need to ensure all staff across the organisation are familiar with our policies, our processes, our procedures, and ensure they are trained in what the law is and what their obligations are underneath it, and what their options are for reporting and so forth in the event that should sexual harassment occur. We need to make sure that the organisation has created accessible and proactive reporting and monitoring mechanisms to ensure that staff can confidentially and privately report instances of sexual harassment and know that they can do so without victimisation or recrimination. And we need to make sure that reports are going to be taken seriously and investigated and addressed in a timely manner. And we need to ensure that our organisations has policies and procedures for taking positive and appropriate actions against staff who may have been found to have breached the law. Now, I want to move to a quick poll, which, looking at that as a brief summary of what we need to be doing, how confident are you that your company is currently in compliance with the new Respect at Work laws? And we'll bring up the options on that poll there, please, Katie, and I'll get you to put a vote in. I don't see that coming up.
Sorry, Deb, we're just having difficulties getting this poll up at the moment.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing the last one. Yeah. Great. Okay, so that poll's now up. So probably similar statistics to those that showed who's familiar with the laws and who's not. We've got a few that are very confident, which is terrific. We've got some that are somewhat confident, and we've got a good 20% who are not confident at all. That's actually pretty good. The statistics that we're seeing around town are much worse than that. So I'm guessing we've got a fairly educated audience here, skewed towards compliance. So it's great, we're confident, but we are going to go through some of the things that we're going to be looking at in terms of ensuring our compliance with the law. One of the things that's, moving on to the next slide, that seems to create issues within organisations is understanding what exactly is and isn't sexual harassment. This is important, not just for the organisation, but for all persons within the organisation. Many people actually suffer from sexual harassment without actually acknowledging or understanding that that's what it is that they are experiencing. So under the Respect at Work laws in Australia, sexual harassment is actually defined as any behaviour that is sexual in nature that a reasonable person would anticipate would make another person feel offended, humiliated, or intimidated. Sexual harassment can take many forms. It's not simply limited to unwelcome physical contact. That might be something that we're all fairly familiar with, and that is what people often think that's sexual harassment, and that's where it starts and ends. So touching, hugging, kissing, or any other sort of physical contact that is unwanted or not requested, of course, is sexual harassment. Then we go to the other types of sexual harassment that many people are not familiar with, but can have really lasting impacts on people. There's the sort of things that we say are verbal abuse and harassment. So that includes sexual comments, jokes, innuendos, insults or slurs that are of a sexual nature. Requests for sexual favours. So this includes requests for sexual favours in exchange for work-related benefits, or perhaps threats to withdraw work-related benefits if sexual favours aren't granted. Display of offensive material. So this includes displaying or sharing sexually offensive images, videos, or any other type of material in the workplace. Stalking or cyber stalking. So this includes repeated and unwanted contact or attention, either in person or online, that is of a sexual nature. And it's worth noting that sexual harassment can be committed by anybody in the workplace. So that includes your colleagues, supervisors, managers, leaders, customers, clients, and it can occur in any type of form of communication, whether it's face-to-face, phone, email, social media. It's important to note that the behaviour does not have to be directed towards the person experiencing the harassment for it to be considered sexual harassment. So somebody witnessing sexual harassment can actually be a victim of sexual harassment. So its scope is very, very broad. It is worth contemplating what is not sexual harassment as well, so that things are not confused. In the context of work, it's certainly useful to take a fairly conservative view in order to avoid allegations of inappropriate behaviour, such as sexual harassment. However, the following behaviours aren't considered sexual harassment. So reasonable management or work-related comment or conduct in connection with the performance of an employee's duties, such as performance management or disciplinary action, would not be considered sexual harassment. Social gatherings and invitations that are consensual and not linked to employment or job advancement. Reasonable physical contact necessary for safety or to perform a task, such as a handshake. Occasional compliments, not of a sexual nature, which are provided in a professional and respectful manner. My ruling on that one is always, when in doubt, don't. If you're not sure what respectful or professional is, say nothing. The mutual attraction or friendships which may lead to consensual and acceptable behaviours may be permissible in the workplace, but this is typically dependent on a workplace's policies. And if such relationships are allowed in the workplace, it is important to ensure there is communication with the company about that relationship, and that your policies ensure that the relationships are consensual and do not involve relationships where power imbalances may be at play. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to have a look at the impacts of sexual harassment. At its heart, sexual harassment is an issue of essentially gender equality. It manifests when structural and social power disparities are abused, and it can cause physical and psychological harm. Workplace sexual harassment can have an adverse effect on workers' experience or witnessing the behaviour, and the impact of those behaviours can really vary markedly in its severity and its impact on workers. Different individuals can perceive and react to behaviours in different ways, which can make workplace sexual harassment a really complex area for employers to manage. And the impacts that sexual harassment has on individual workers really depends on the individual circumstances of an individual worker. So we really need to be conscious that the act that is involved may have no effect on one person, but have a great effect on somebody else. So the most typical types of harassment that we're all familiar with is, of course, your physical injuries that are caused by assault. But perhaps the less visual impacts of sexual harassment include things such as feelings of isolation from family, friends, work, loss of confidence and withdrawal, depression, anxiety, stress, and illnesses that stems from those things, such as post-traumatic stress disorder and immune deficiency, cardiovascular and musculoskeletal disorders that stem from stress. And of course, on the worst case scenario, self-harm or suicide as a result of the impact that sexual harassment has. So we are talking about very, very serious consequences that can result as a result of sexual harassment. So it is no wonder that we are looking to prevent these from our workplace. Now, I'm going to move to the next slide. And one of the things that I have been asked so often since the legislation came into effect is, can I have a training course to train my staff on it? And then I can pretty much check the box and I'll be compliant. The answer is no. I can't give you a training course to check a box. And they say, well, that's just what our leaders have asked us to do. Our management team have asked us to train the staff and so that we're compliant with the legislation. And I say, well, your leaders need to understand the legislation better because it's much more than just simply training your staff. And they say, well, they don't care. And the point there becomes, well, how do I make them care? And there are many people here in people and culture and HR that have been given the duty to implement processes to ensure that we're preventing sexual harassment. But it is really, really important that all of our leaders understand just how great the risks are for our organisation in the event we are not compliant with this legislation. So for starters, for the perpetrator, the person who sexually harasses an individual, there is going to be repercussions such as job loss, reputational harm, career damage, and potential exposure to personal liability under the Sexual Discrimination Act. But for the organisation, it is far, far greater. Not only are you going to have vicarious liability for the acts of your staff that will fall under the grounds of fines, penalties, and damages under the Sex Discrimination Act, under the Workplace Health and Safety legislation, under the Fair Work Act. So you've got a myriad of codes by which you can be found liable for not preventing sexual harassment. But potentially the worst and the most damaging is the reputational damage that you can suffer. We are all becoming very familiar, and unfortunately way too familiar, with front paper news headlines of sexual harassment happening from leaders at the highest levels of our organisations. That person's career is permanently maimed. They will no longer receive a job in corporate Australia. Their company has been undeniably harmed from its brand and from its reputation point of view. That's going to limit your short-term shareholder value and your long-term shareholder value as customers work with their feet from not wanting to associate themselves with a company that would allow such conduct to occur. We're also going to find that we're going to have difficulty with attraction and retention of staff because people do not want to work for an organisation where they're at risk of sexual harassment. And of course, all of these events going on around our organisation have an impact on our productivity because our staff start talking about the events of what's going on rather than getting on with their work in a safe and respectful environment. And of course, on the minimum scale, we're going to have some increased insurance costs for liabilities and claims upon your liabilities policies in relation to paying for all the penalties that come as a result of breach. So the consequences of non-compliance are large, and your positive duty to comply is enormous. So this is no longer something that we can sweep under the carpet with a checkerbox training course. This is holistic legislation that you need to look at throughout the entirety of your organisational structure and everything that you do. I'm going to take a quick poll here, and I'm going to ask whether or not you're confident that the new Respect at Work laws will effectively address and prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. Yeah, really interesting poll. We're going from strongly agree to somewhat agree to a few disagreeing and some unsure. I'd love to know the disagree. And to the greatest extent that I believe in legislation, I think and believe this is the most powerful legislation that I've seen come out on this topic anywhere in the world. And it's actually quite exciting that we are looking to prevent sexual harassment. I do think it is going to be a very difficult thing to implement for many organisations, especially those where we have gender inequality and diversity and inclusion issues in our senior leadership issues. I'm sorry, in our senior leadership structures, and unless those inequalities and power imbalances are changed, it is an environment where sexual harassment is likely to continue. That said, those leaders should be very worried about the legislation and the penalties in the event that such conduct continues to occur. Thanks for that, Katie. This is a really holistic and long slide. And it's going to take me a little while to get through, so bear with looking at the same screen for a while. I'm going to encourage you to, as I go through this, look at the dot points throughout each of the sections. Effectively, the Respect at Work website and have created a wonderful framework for preventing and responding to sexual harassment in the workplace. Essentially, that framework contains the intended outcomes and indicators of good practice for employers with respect to preventing and responding to sexual harassment. These indicators capture the factors that are likely to lead to a respectful and inclusive workplace, and one which minimises the risk of sexual harassment. The framework also includes both simple and mature measurements, which allows employers of different sizes to assess their performance against each indicator. Now, it's really important to recognise that the duty to prevent is a proportionate measurement. Now, the proportion to which you'll be held to prevent and what you'll be required to do will be a standard that is appropriate to the size of your business. So a large business will be held to a very, very high standard and will be expected to have mature measurements in place for preventing sexual harassment. So I encourage you all to go to this framework. Nathan's kindly put a link into the chat that you can click onto this at the Respect at Work framework. I have created a useful summary here for you from that framework. But essentially, it takes us through leadership, knowledge, culture, risk assessment and transparency, support, reporting and measurement, and what we should be doing in each of these areas from we're still sort of starting out to we're a mature organisation in acts to prevent sexual harassment from occurring. So consistent with a Respect at Work report, the framework takes a holistic approach that looks just beyond policies and training and complaint handling procedures, which is sort of very basic 101 of looking to prevent this. And it looks for person-centered and trauma-informed reporting with a focus on practical outcomes. It is adaptable for employers of all sizes and all industries. So anybody can take this framework as a beginning point. And it's all designed around minimising harm to workers and to providing indicators organised around those key areas identified in the Respect at Work report. Now, everybody should note here that this is a resource that's been collated to assist organisations to prevent and respond to workplace sexual harassment, but it is not a comprehensive statement, and it is the legal responsibility for yourselves is up to yourselves to look at your own organisations and your own duties and obligations within your own jurisdictions to look to how you can frame this to work for yourselves. Just a couple of key points that I have made with each of these sections that I want to point out to you. The leadership and governance section, I'm actually going to address that a little more as we go forward, but we need to ensure that our leaders are being held accountable to and are committed to preventing and responding to sexual harassment. There needs to be a clear policy, and ideally we need to have a commitment from our leadership team to diversity and inclusion, where we've got things like metrics and bonuses for meeting targets for D&I. And we need to make sure that diversity and inclusion, safety and respect is a focus in all of our hiring and all of our staffing, and that our leaders are rewarded for modelling safe, respective and inclusive behaviours. So if you have a leadership team that is not looking at these things and not doing these things, is it likely your organisation will be found to be in breach of the new provisions? The answer to that is yes. And as leaders, especially directors of companies, there is personal accountability and liability under the work health and safety legislation. So if you've got a leadership team that is still not invested in diversity and inclusion and of fixing power imbalances across your organisation, whether that's gender or any type of minority in your organisation. These are the areas where sexual harassment can occur and where our leaders need to be moving from power imbalances and inequitable balances in our minority groups. So the diversity and inclusion goals, which once upon a time many leaders saw as something warm and fuzzy and something that we put in as part of our compliance with an ESG framework, now actually have a legislated means for why we need to be doing these things and the importance for meeting D&I targets. Knowledge is critical for all of our workers and leaders in understanding what is safe and respectful behaviour and what to do if people don't feel safe, respected and or included. We need to have a broad range of training on a broad range of topics. This is not one topic. This is not training on respect at work. This is training on diversity, inclusion, unconscious bias, discrimination, work health and safety. This is holistic legislation. I'll talk to training a little bit more as we go through. But staff not only need to be trained once, they actually need access to ongoing training materials. So if you train your staff once, they need to have permanent access to those training materials. Those materials need to be permanently updated in and alongside the law as soon as it changes. And there's been a lot of changes to a lot of these bits of laws recently. So all of the courses need to be updated, and we need to make sure that anything that we're teaching our staff within these training materials is tested and assessed. It's not enough to click a completion button. We need to make sure that staff have understood the training. Training to check a box is no longer legitimate. The commissioner is not going to be looking for the fact that you have simply trained your staff. We need staff to actually learn and understand what sexual harassment is and what they can do. Other aspects to look at are culture, and that's a really holistic one. I've talked to some of that in leadership in governments, but diversity, inclusion are really, really important. Equality, all of those things are vital to ensuring we eliminate power boundaries power imbalances where sexual harassment can occur. And then we move to risk assessment, where we're ensuring we're including all the risks for sexual harassment in our WHS frameworks. Onto support, we need to ensure that workers affected by sexual harassment have access to high quality support, that responding staff are well trained to respond to harassment reports and ideally trained in trauma-informed reporting. And we need to ensure that there's access to external support services and support for our responding staff as well. We need to make sure from a reporting point of view, our workers feel safe to report sexual harassment without fear of recrimination or victimisation. And we need a transparent investigation process. And then we need robust and transparent measuring frameworks in place so that we can measure sexual harassment initiatives that we've got, and to ensure that we can adequately report to the board on incidents, consequences and risks. For publicly listed companies, this may also include public reporting of these items. Just quickly onto the role of leadership. Leadership plays an absolutely critical role in creating a safe and respectful workplace. Leaders set the framework for preventing and responding to sexual harassment, and they should also model a diverse, inclusive, and trusted and gender equal culture. If that is not what you have in your organisations right now, I suggest that the first place to start is with leadership training. And ideally, we want to be ensuring that a proportion of leaders' performance agreements and contracts are containing targets around gender equality, diversity, and inclusion outcomes. The expectations around conduct in relation to fostering a safe and respectful, inclusive organisational culture and those which don't have power imbalances are so critical to the prevention of this type of action. Leaders really need to have a really strong understanding of the strong drivers of where sexual harassment occurs and prioritise gender equality. The leadership shadow model, which I've got displayed within this slide, was developed by the Champions of Change Coalition and Chief Executive Women, which helps leaders understand the impact that their behaviours have on preventing and responding to sexual harassment. The 4 elements of the model include what leaders say, how they act, what they prioritise, and what they measure. So leaders must lead by example. And I've spoken to many people who've said that I've been appointed to this role, but leaders aren't going to make a change. This is where you need to start. As I've always said in every talk I've ever done, the tone at the top sets the mood in the middle, which creates the buzz at the bottom. The other popular adage is fish rots from the head. All of these are appropriate. In order to deliver lasting performance and improvers, leaders must consider processes and practices within the organisation that affect their behaviour, including recruitment processes, leader training, education, setting clear expectations. It's remarkable the things that leaders need to be doing now in order to be compliant with this legislation. So I am going to quickly move on to a poll, and I'm going to ask what steps your company has taken to date to ensure your compliance with the new Respect at Work laws. So we've got leadership training, we've got survey and benchmarking of staff, we've got training and education for all employees, we've got reviewing and updating workplace policies, we've got creating new reporting processes, or anything else that we might be looking at. So our starting point in all of this is reviewing and updating workplace policies. So that's great that a very large amount of you are looking at that at the moment. It looks like we're starting to train staff too, so that's great. Leadership training is low, which is scary because that should probably also be at the beginning of looking to prevent this. And I think we probably want to have documented training to show that we have put in a lot of work into training our leaders. Surveying staff's an interesting one, and I'm going to talk about surveying staff in a moment, actually, as we move to the next slide. So moving on to the final slide before I move towards Q&A, I want to talk about Safetrac a little bit and how we can help you in creating a safe, inclusive and respectable workplace. So as many of you are aware, we do provide training in all of the listed topics there. So sexual harassment, discrimination, bullying and harassment, diversity and inclusion, work health and safety, unconscious bias. There's management and leadership training, and there's code of conducts that obviously need to be updated. It is not enough to simply train your staff in sexual harassment. Yes, I'm happy to give you a course on sexual harassment, but for all of you who are saying, well, I've already trained my staff in all those other things, every single one of those bits of those training courses needs to be updated and in line with the current legislation. So the Respect at Work Act effectively changed all those pieces of legislation that affects all of those training frameworks. So they all need to be updated in with the current law. So yes, training's a really important and fundamental part of knowledge, information for our staff and our leaders. I want to note that for all of the Safetrac subscribers who subscribe to our training, whether it be via SCORM or via our platform, we have recently released our legislative update portal, which enables you to see which courses have had changes implemented and where the updates are for those courses. So we let you know if there's legislation that is pending or which has actually happened, and when the release for that course is out. Now, when a course is impacted, let's say the discrimination course is impacted by the sexual harassment course, to the extent that you've already rolled out that course for the year and you don't want to have to re-roll it out, rolling out the sexual harassment course or a boost to learn on the discrimination course will get you up to speed with that legislation. So our booster learns are a really great way of meaning that you don't need to re-roll out that course again if you already have. That said, I think we've just about completed the process of updating all of those courses with all customizations. for all clients. So if you have not received all of your updates in relation to each of those courses, you should be receiving them very shortly. For those who are not current subscribers and aren't aware of our services, please know that we have off-the-shelf courses that are available in all of those topics, plus a whole lot more. But what's really important is that those off-the-shelf topics can be customized and redesigned to look and feel and act just like your own courses. There is precious little point in rolling out a purely generic training course. What is absolutely critical is ensuring that that course is updated to your own policies and procedures and reporting procedures. So we want to be training staff not only on the law, but on how your organisation is implementing the law. So let's look at policies and how we distribute those. Throughout the Safetrac platform, you can now not only distribute your training course, but you can now distribute all of your policies so that you can have all of your staff enrolled in your policies. You can have them, we can turn those policies into training courses, which is a really interactive way of making sure your staff understand the policies rather than just getting them to read a policy. We can actually turn it into a training course. That's part of our bespoke design courses. And we can then have them have an acknowledgement that's signed off on their platform that says, I've read, understood, and agree to comply with the policies, so that you can have that sign off alongside your training, which in the event of regulatory intervention is a really great way of being able to show a regulator, we updated our policies, they signed them off here, we updated them again, we signed them off here, the training was updated here, complete training records, all of that information. And now I quickly want to talk about survey and benchmarking. So in order to understand what situation we currently have in our workplaces and what sort of conduct has been witnessed, experienced, seen, we can't just ask, have you been sexually harassed? A lot of people don't actually know what sexual harassment is other than the physical type of harassment. So benchmarking people's experience, understanding where they find the culture of the organisation, whether the leadership are committed to preventative action, whether reports have been made, what the response was, how supported they were, whether the reaction and the treatment of both the victim and the harasser, what happened, what were the consequences, were they satisfactory? These are all the types of things that we want to be doing now as we launch our policies to see what sort of a state our organisation is. Ideally, those surveys should not be done by you. Safetrac can conduct those benchmark surveys on your behalf, and we can report back to you any risks and problems that you have in your organisation, which will be de-identified so that your staff is safe to report safely any conduct that may make them unsafe. So we know that we're going to get honest and legitimate responses and provided back to you unidentified. Now, it's really important that we do that because if we want to show that we're making actions to prevent these actions from occurring, being able to benchmark where you were at a certain point of time, then going through a whole lot of initiatives, changing our policies, retraining our staff, making sure everybody's aware of what's around, making sure our reporting techniques are in place, etc. And then re-benchmarking people, we could show and demonstrate commitment to the purpose and that we are addressing issues and we are attempting to prevent sexual harassment occurring in our workplaces. I'd also say that we've also got and created an audit questionnaire that enables you to check your own compliance with the legislation. So have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done that? All of those audits and surveys are available in our Gold platform. So if you haven't spoken to an account manager about those yet, they're available to talk about all of those things, which is exciting. So I'm going to move now onto our questionnaires. And sorry, not to our questionnaires, to a bit of Q&A. So over the last few days, I've received a number of questions. And I have actually received, just been in conversations with people. So I wanted a couple of things that I would point out to you and then ones that we've actually had submitted. So a really good one I had the other day was an employee in a retail store witnessed a consensual sexual act between two customers in a store. Is that sexual harassment? The answer to that is yes, it is. And the reality is, whilst it's not within the workers, it is a customer. So customers are caught up within that. So that employee was indeed subjected to sexual harassment. And the answer is what should or could have been done to prevent it. So a range of things. So firstly, codes of conduct for customers within stores to make it clear such conduct would be illegal. We've often seen a lot of signs around stores now sort of saying our staff must not be subjected to bullying and harassment. That needs to be extended. We need to ensure that there are satisfactory cameras and reporting provisions to ensure that we're monitoring for this sort of thing not occurring. And really importantly, the reporting procedures of that organisation need to be in place to ensure if such conduct was witnessed, that staff member knew where to report that to, and that they were trained and felt supported to report that and what would happen as a result of that. And as a result of that, that person should have received counselling and support to support her in what she'd witnessed in that store. So if the store had done nothing about that, that store would be held to be in contravention of the Respect of Work Act, should that employee choose to take an action. That gives you an idea of just how holistic this legislation is and what we need to be doing as an organisation to prevent these items from occurring. So I'm going to move to the next question. And the next question that we have is, how can we evaluate the effectiveness of our efforts to prevent and address sexual harassment and make changes if necessary? Great question. So to evaluate the effectiveness of our efforts, it's really important to have a comprehensive approach that includes regular feedback and data analysis. Some steps that can be taken, I have certainly addressed a little bit in the framework, but regular employee surveys, so conducting anonymised surveys of employees to gather their perceptions and experiences regarding sexual harassment in the workplace. Incident reporting analysis, so analysing the number and types of incidents reported, as well as the response times and the effectiveness of the investigations. Employee training evaluation, we need to measure the impact of our training efforts through both employee feedback and of testing of their understanding as to what constitutes sexual harassment and how to report it. That testing part that comes at the end of training is really important. I would note at that point that all Safetrac courses have a testing component to them. We don't simply train users in a topic, we actually test their knowledge at the end of it. That actually becomes utterly essential under this legislation. Culture assessments, so we want to regularly assess the overall culture of the organisation to identify where improvements can be made. And management accountability, so holding managers and leaders accountable for preventing and addressing sexual harassment in the workplace. And of course, of regularly evaluating their performance in the area. And by regularly going and gathering and analysing this information, we can make more informed decisions to improve our efforts to prevent and address sexual harassment. We can also track, or as I've said, benchmark our progress over time to make changes as needed to ensure that we are meeting our goals and creating a safe and respectful workplace for all employees where sexual harassment is actually prevented. So on to our next question, which is how can we evaluate, I think I just did that, sorry, I'm on to the next slide. How do you get employees to participate and be engaged in creating a safe and respectful workplace? Again, great question, thank you. Creating a safe and respectful workplace really requires the participation of all staff, so all employees, and may even go down to vendors and contractors, ideally. So here are some of the ways that I'd recommend that we engage staff and persons that we're training in this effort. So firstly, we have communication. So effective communication, effective, safe and respectful communication is essential for engaging employees in creating a safe and respectful workplace. Organisations can regularly communicate their expectations and commitment to creating a safe and respectful workplace, along with publicising the actions that they're taking to address and prevent sexual harassment. So this can be done through, yes, training, but then following that training up with emails, newsletters, social media, and importantly, reporting. So open and accountable reporting to the organisation. If something's happening, let's not sweep it under a carpet. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why it's inappropriate. Let's talk about the harm that inappropriate conduct can cause, and let's talk about the consequence of what's happened to the people who have been involved in that conduct. So training, providing regular training to all employees on what constitutes sexual harassment, how to report it, and the steps the organisation's taking to prevent it can help engage our staff. I would say that it is really important that your training is of a high quality. This is not the place for a click and flick training course. We need training that actually changes behaviour and that makes people understand the content. So there's lots of cheap and cheerful, nasty compliance training around. It is not the place for that. You want training that is clear, that is engaging, that has scenarios, that has interactions, and is preferably customised to your own workplace and customised to your own workplace policies, procedures, and reporting. So we need employee feedback. So we need to create avenues for employees to provide feedback on their experience and perceptions of sexual harassment. And that will enable us to help identify areas where we need to improve and to demonstrate our commitment to making those improvements to create a safe and respectful workplace. Involvement, we need to provide plenty of opportunities for employees to be involved in the development and implementation of policies and programs. So we're not going to create policies in a vacuum. We want to be doing it in collaboration and communication actually with our staff so that they feel that we're making policies that are aimed at preventing sexual harassment that they may have witnessed or experienced, and that they can actually help engage in that effort. Now that can include employee focus groups, feedback sessions, as I've said before, benchmarking and surveys, but participation, open participation in committees and task forces is a really great way to include your staff and involve them in ensuring sexual harassment is prevented in our workplace. Recognizing employees who demonstrate positive behaviours and contribute to safe and respectful workplaces are really, really helpful in helping to create a culture where this sort of behaviour is valued. So this can include peer recognition, awards, public acknowledgement of positive behaviour, and even KPIs, especially for our leaders along things like diversity and inclusion metrics being met. And then we can also have things like employee resource groups. They can be a valuable tool for engaging employees in an effort to prevent sexual harassment. So employee resource groups can provide a safe and supportive space for employees to share their experiences and perspectives and to work together to develop solutions and workshop recommendations for how sexual harassment can be addressed in the workplace. And by involving all staff in creating this sort of safe and respectful workplace, organisations can begin to build a culture where everyone feels valued, respected and empowered to speak up against sexual harassment. When employees feel safe and respected, they're more likely to speak up and say, hey, I'm not actually okay with that. And it being able to be reported and stopped before it gets any more serious or it causes real and lasting damage. So that really, the culture of our organisations really becomes quite critical as an ongoing preventative measure. I'm going to do one more question because I'm running out of time. Katie, I'm going to quickly skip over the is consensual relationship with a fellow member of staff sexual harassment. I'm going to say it depends on your policy. In some workplaces, it is not allowed and it should be governed by policy. And I would say that to the extent that it is allowed, we need to make sure it is not as a result of a power imbalance. So this was a really great one we got today. What should be contained in a workplace policy to prevent sexual harassment? So really quickly, there are some key elements that you need to address. So we need a clear statement that sexual harassment will not be tolerated. wherever it takes place and whenever it takes place, including third parties such as clients or customers. We need to set workplace standards for behaviours, attitudes and languages that where disrespect or exclusion of people based on gender identity, sexual orientation, or assumptions about dominant gender stereotypes are eliminated from our workplaces. All of these things need to be addressed to address power imbalances in our workplaces. We need to define sexual harassment. We need to recognise that it is unlawful, and we need to state what laws that it is illegal under and what recourse under those laws is available. We need examples of the types of behaviours that are not allowed. We need to address the appropriate use of social media and technology. We need to ensure there are control measures to sexual harassment. We need to look at the duties levels of workers, including managers and supervisors, the consequences of breaching the policy, what a worker should do if they experience sexual harassment, how they can report it, the process the organisation will undertake upon receiving a report, guarantees and assurances that persons reporting the report will be kept confidential and private and be dealt with confidentiality, and that there will be no victimisation or harassment of a person who may be reported. And of course, we want support services available for all persons involved. So that's very quick. There is actually a draft policy on the Respect at Work website, and we also have a draft policy that we'd be happy to distribute with our clients if you want a starting point. Please note, it is a starting point, and you do need to address it to your own organisation. Katie, if we can move to the final slide, please. I just want to make you aware of a number of resources that are available to you. These are really, really important resources that are available to you. So I encourage you to visit the Respect at Work website. Also, other things that you should be looking at as organisations are the Safe Work Australia, Champions for Change, and I referred you to the Good Practice Framework. And then there's a whole lot of support for individuals who suffer from sexual harassment. The Respect at Work website provides a comprehensive set of resources, but you've also got a range of other not-for-profit organisations such as Beyond Blue, Lifeline, Reach Out, Men's Healthline, Suicide Callback Services. We need to make sure that all of our staff are aware of these services and where to go in the event that they are a victim of harassment. So moving on to the final slide, I would like to thank you all very much. I think I am very much on time. I've done that all in an hour, which is great. I was worried I wouldn't. What I'd like to invite you to do is, if you would like any more information from us, if we can help you in any way, if you'd like to learn more, you can book a consultation with any of our compliance experts on the link provided in the chat. So if there is, if you'd like to organise a meeting, you simply click on that and you'll be able to book a session with one of our consultants. Thank you for those who've provided feedback. That's really lovely. I really appreciate you attending today. And I hope that you found it all useful and beneficial. And I look forward to you all creating workplaces where sexual harassment is eliminated. Thank you all for your time. Very much appreciated. Thank you.